The old man risked his life to save a stranger's child. But as their bond grew stronger, the boy's tears at school revealed something that shook the entire community. Frank Morrison grabbed his reusable shopping bag from the counter at Johnson's grocery store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he checked his receipt one last time. 6:30 p.m., right on schedule. "Stay dry out there, Mr. Morrison," Tommy, the teenage cashier, called out. "Weather report says it's gonna pour tonight." Frank nodded, pushing the door open with his free hand. His arthritis acted up as he gripped the bag tighter. The evening air felt heavy, thick with the promise of rain. Dark clouds loomed overhead, and the street lights had already clicked on, casting yellow pools on the empty sidewalk. The first drops hit his nose as he turned onto Maple Street. His house was only 4 blocks away, but his joints protested with each step. The radio this morning had warned about the storm, but he'd stuck to his routine anyway. 30 years of teaching physical education had taught him the importance of consistency. The rain picked up, drumming against the pavement. Frank's grip on the bag tightened as memories of another rainy night flooded back. Sarah had been driving home from her book club. The roads were slick. The other driver had run a red light. Thunder cracked overhead. Frank quickened his pace, his shoes squeaking against the wet concrete. The bag of groceries grew heavier with each block. A car passed by, its headlights cutting through the rain. The sound of tires on wet asphalt brought back the screech of brakes, the crunch of metal. "Not now," Frank muttered, forcing the memories away. He focused on his breathing, counting steps like he used to do with his students. 1, 2, 3, 4. The intersection of Maple and Oak Street lay ahead. Through the curtain of rain, Frank saw a small figure on a bicycle approaching the crossing. A boy, maybe 12 or 13, pedaling hard against the wind. The bike's reflectors caught the glow of approaching headlights. Frank's throat tightened. A delivery truck was barreling down Oak Street, its wipers working overtime. The boy hit a puddle, his bike sliding sideways on the slick road. Time slowed down. Frank saw it all with crystal clarity. The truck's bright headlights, the boy's startled expression, the bike skidding toward the intersection. His body moved before his mind could catch up. The grocery bag hit the ground. Cans rolled across the wet pavement as Frank sprinted forward. His joints screamed in protest, but adrenaline pushed him on. The truck's horn blared. The boy's eyes widened in terror. Frank reached him just as the bike went down. He grabbed the boy's jacket, yanking him backward with all his strength. They fell together, hard. Frank felt a sharp crack in his side as they hit the ground. The truck roared past, inches away, sending up a spray of water. Pain shot through Frank's ribs. He lay on his back in the rain, gasping. The boy scrambled to his knees beside him. Mister, are you okay?" The boy's voice shook. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Frank tried to sit up but fell back, wincing. "Are you hurt?" "And no, but you're bleeding." The boy pointed to Frank's arm, where his sleeve had torn on the pavement. Lights appeared as cars began stopping. Doors slammed. Voices called out in the darkness. "Someone call an ambulance." "What happened?" The boy almost got hit. A woman ran toward them, her shoes splashing through puddles. "Marcus! Oh my God! Marcus!" She dropped to her knees, pulling the boy into a tight embrace. "Mom, he saved me." "The boy?" Marcus said through tears. "The truck was coming, and he pulled me out of the way." The woman turned to Frank, her eyes wide with gratitude and concern. "Sir, don't move. Help is coming." She shrugged off her jacket and draped it over him. "I'm Diana Williams. This is my son, Marcus." "Thank you. Thank you so much." Frank heard sirens in the distance. The rain kept falling, but he barely felt it now. His side burned with each breath. Diana held her umbrella over him while Marcus clutched his mother's free hand, still shaking. "The groceries," Frank mumbled, remembering his dropped bag. "Don't worry about that now," Diana said firmly. "Just stay still." The ambulance arrived in a flash of red and white lights. Paramedics swarmed around them, asking questions, checking vitals. Frank answered mechanically, his eyes drifting to Marcus's scared face. "You okay, son?" he managed to ask as they lifted him onto a stretcher. Marcus nodded, wiping his eyes. "Yes, sir. I'm so sorry about your groceries." Frank tried to smile through the pain. "Just a few cans. Not worth a young life." In the ambulance, as paramedics worked around him, Frank heard one of them say something about a fractured rib. The pain medication they gave him started to kick in, making everything fuzzy around the edges. He thought about Sarah, about how she would have been proud of what he'd done. Hours later, after x-rays and examinations, Frank lay in his hospital bed listening to the steady beep of monitors. A police officer had taken his statement. Diana and Marcus had waited until visiting hours ended, despite his insistence that they go home and dry off. "We'll come see you tomorrow," Diana had promised, her hand squeezing his. "Get some rest, Mr. Morrison." Now, in the quiet of his room, Frank stared at the ceiling. His ribs ached despite the painkillers. Tomorrow, he'd go home to his empty house, to his routine of morning walks and chess games in the park. But something felt different. The image of Marcus's face stayed with him. The terror, then the relief, then the concern. For the first time in 5 years, Frank fell asleep thinking about something other than Sarah's accident. Instead, he thought about a boy on a bicycle and how quickly life could change on a rainy night. 3 days after the accident, Frank sat in his recliner, holding an ice pack against his ribs. The doctor had given him strict instructions: rest, ice, and no sudden movements. The TV droned quietly in the background, more for company than entertainment. The doorbell rang, breaking the afternoon silence. Frank winced as he pushed himself up from the chair. He wasn't expecting anyone. The few friends he had knew about his injury and had called instead of visiting. The bell rang again as he shuffled to the door. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of a familiar face, the boy from the accident. Marcus stood on the porch, clutching a paper bag. His mother waited a few steps behind him. Frank opened the door, trying to hide his discomfort. "Well, this is a surprise." "Hi, Mr. Morrison," Marcus said, his voice small. "We brought you something." He held out the bag, hands trembling slightly. Come in, Frank stepped aside. "It's too hot to stand out there." Diana placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder as they entered. "We hope we're not disturbing your rest, Mr. Morrison." Marcus insisted on bringing you this. The living room felt different with visitors in it. Frank noticed the layer of dust on the bookshelf, the faded photographs on the wall. He gestured to the couch. "Please, sit down. And call me Frank." Marcus perched on the edge of the couch, still holding the bag. Diana sat beside him, her eyes taking in the room. The chess set on the side table, the stack of old magazines, the single coffee mug on the coaster. "What's in the bag?" Frank asked, easing himself back into his recliner. Marcus reached inside and pulled out several cans. "To replace the ones I made you drop. Mom helped me remember what was in your grocery bag." Frank's throat tightened. "You didn't have to do that, son." "Yes, I did," Marcus said firmly. He reached into the bag again, pulling out a small container. "Mom made her special chicken soup." Diana smiled. "It's the least we could do." "How are you feeling?" "Sore. But I'll live." Frank adjusted the ice pack. "The doctor says the rib will heal in a few weeks." An uncomfortable silence fell. Marcus fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. Frank noticed a scrape on the boy's elbow, probably from the fall. "Do you play?" Marcus suddenly asked, pointing to the chess set. "Used to play with my students." Frank nodded. "I was a PE teacher, but we had a chess club after school." Marcus's eyes lit up. "Could you teach me? Mom got me a chess app, but I don't really understand it." "Marcus," Diana warned, "Mr. Moore, Frank needs to rest." Frank waved off her concern. "Teaching chess doesn't require much movement. Besides, it's good to exercise the mind while the body heals." He caught Diana's eye. "If it's all right with you, of course." Diana hesitated, then smiled. "Well, if you're sure it won't strain you, can we start now?" Marcus was already moving toward the chess set. "First, let's have some of your mother's soup," Frank suggested. "I haven't had homemade food in a long time." In the kitchen, Diana insisted on serving. Frank watched as she moved efficiently, finding bowls and spoons like she'd been there before. Marcus helped, careful not to make too much noise. "Sorry about the dust," Frank said. "I'm not much for housekeeping these days." Diana ladled soup into bowls. "Please, you should see our place when I'm working double shifts. Marcus is learning to cook, though. Right, baby?" "Made scrambled eggs yesterday," Marcus announced proudly. "Only burned them a little." They ate at the small kitchen table, the soup filling the house with warmth. Frank couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal here. The chairs had sat empty since Sarah. A movement caught his eye. Through the kitchen window, he saw Mrs. Peterson from next door watching them. She quickly drew her curtains when she noticed him looking. "Everything okay?" Diana asked, following his gaze. "Fine," Frank said quickly. "Just neighbors being neighbors." After soup, Frank set up the chessboard while Diana cleaned up, ignoring his protests. Marcus sat across from him, eager to learn. "Each piece moves differently," Frank explained, picking up a pawn. "Like life, you need to think about each move before you make it." Marcus absorbed every word, asking questions, making mistakes, and trying again. Diana watched from the couch, her phone forgotten in her lap. "Mom, look!" Marcus exclaimed after successfully capturing a pawn. "I did it! Great job, baby!" Diana checked her watch and sighed. "But we should go. I have the late shift tonight." Disappointment crossed Marcus's face. "Can we come back tomorrow? Please?" Diana looked at Frank, uncertainty in her eyes. "We don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Frank said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "The door's open if you want to learn more chess, Marcus." Marcus beamed. "Really? Mom? Can I? If Mr. Frank is sure." Diana stood, gathering her purse. "Maybe after school? I work until 6. "Perfect timing for chess lessons," Frank nodded. At the door, Marcus surprised Frank with a careful hug, mindful of his injured ribs. "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Frank. And for the chess." Diana's eyes glistened. "We can never thank you enough." After they left, Frank stood at the window, watching them walk down the street. Marcus turned back once, waving enthusiastically. Frank waved back, ignoring the twinge in his side. The house felt emptier now, the silence heavier. Frank walked slowly back to the kitchen, looking at the clean dishes in the rack, the lingering smell of soup in the air. His eyes fell on Sarah's old apron, still hanging on its hook. "What would you think of all this, Sarah?" he whispered. The next morning, Frank woke earlier than usual. He took his pain medication, did his gentle stretching exercises, and found himself straightening up the living room. He dusted the chess set, adjusted the photographs on the wall, and opened windows to let in fresh air. Around 10, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Peterson. "Frank, dear," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "I saw you had visitors yesterday. Everything all right?" Frank's jaw tightened. "Everything's fine, Helen. Just the boy I helped and his mother bringing some soup." "Oh." A pause. "Well, if you need anything, any help with situations." "The only situation I have is a healing rib." Frank cut her off politely but firmly. "But thank you for your concern." He hung up, staring at the phone. In all his years on this street, he'd never given neighbors reason to gossip. Now, watching Mrs. Peterson's curtains twitch again, he wondered what stories were already spreading. But when he looked at the chess set up and ready for Marcus's next lesson, he found he didn't care much about neighborhood gossip. For the first time in years, he had something to look forward to. 2 weeks passed, and Marcus's visits became part of Frank's daily routine. Every afternoon at 3:30, the doorbell would ring, and the boy would burst in, backpack full of homework and head full of chess questions. "Check this out, Mr. Frank." Marcus dropped his math test on the chessboard. A red stood out at the top of the page. "First one this year." Frank adjusted his reading glasses. "Now that's what I call progress." He picked up the test, noting the careful calculations in the margins. "Your strategy is improving, just like in chess, right?" Marcus grinned, setting up the board. "Think before you move." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as they settled into their usual positions. Frank had stopped caring about Mrs. Peterson's curtains constantly twitching next door. "Your mom working late again?" Frank asked, making his opening move. Marcus nodded, studying the board. "Double shift at the diner. But she got an interview for that office job next week. The one at Palmer Insurance." "Yeah, she's nervous about it." Marcus moved his pawn. "Says it could change everything for us." Frank watched the boy's face. In 2 weeks, he'd learned to read Marcus's expressions like chess positions. Right now, worry clouded his usually bright eyes. "Change can be good," Frank said, moving his knight. "Like changing your position on the board to protect your king." A knock at the door interrupted their game. Frank stood slowly, his ribs still tender but healing. Through the window, he saw Bill Thompson, the neighbor from across the street. "Afternoon, Frank," Bill said when the door opened. His eyes darted past Frank to Marcus at the chessboard. "Got a minute? We're in the middle of a game, Bill." Bill lowered his voice. "It's about that, actually. Some folks in the neighborhood are concerned." Heat rose in Frank's neck. "Concerned about chess? You know what I mean, Frank. A man your age, alone with—" "Finish that sentence, Bill." Frank's voice turned to steel. "I dare you." Bill stepped back, hands raised. "I'm just passing along what people are saying. Being neighborly." "Neighborly?" Frank felt his hands shake. "I taught your son Tommy in PE for 2 years. Coached his baseball team. Did anyone question that? That was different. You were a teacher then. I'm still a teacher. And that boy in there." Frank pointed inside. "Is learning chess from the man who saved his life. That's all anyone needs to know." Bill shuffled his feet. "Look, Frank, no one's saying you did anything wrong, saving him. It's just these continued visits." "Good afternoon, Bill." Frank shut the door firmly. Inside, Marcus sat frozen at the chessboard. "Mr. Frank? Are people mad that I come here?" Frank's heart sank. "No, son. People just don't understand sometimes. Because you're white and I'm black." The directness of the question hit Frank like a physical blow. He sat down heavily in his chair. "Some people," he said carefully, "are scared of things they don't want to understand. But that's their problem, not ours." Marcus moved his bishop. "Mom says that too. But sometimes at school." "What happens at school?" "Nothing." Marcus shrugged, but his shoulders tensed. "Just some kids talking." Before Frank could press further, the front door opened. Diana walked in, still in her diner uniform. "Mom!" Marcus checked the clock. "You're early." Diana's face was tight. "Had a talk with my manager today. About complaints they've been getting." Frank's stomach dropped. "What kind of complaints?" "The kind that happen when people see me dropping my son off at a white man's house every day." Diana's voice cracked. "I could lose my job, Frank." Marcus jumped up. "But that's not fair. Mr. Frank is teaching me chess. He helps me with math. Life isn't fair, baby." Diana sat down, exhausted. "And people are cruel sometimes." Frank stood up. "Decision made. Then we'll stop the lessons." "No." Marcus grabbed his arm. "Please, no." "Frank," Diana started, but he held up his hand. "Just until things calm down. Until you get that office job." He looked at Marcus's devastated face. "Sometimes in chess, you have to sacrifice a piece to protect your position." Diana shook her head. "This isn't your sacrifice to make, Frank. You've done nothing wrong. Neither have you. Neither has Marcus." Frank gestured around the room. "But I'm just an old man with an empty house. You have jobs to protect, a future to think about." Marcus knocked over his king. "I don't want to stop coming here." A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the street was quiet. But Frank imagined the curtains twitching in every window, the phones ringing in every house, the whispers spreading like poison. 2 weeks, Diana said finally. "Give me 2 weeks to find another job. Then we'll decide." Marcus wiped his eyes. "Can we at least finish today's game?" Frank looked at Diana, who nodded. They reset the board, but the pieces felt heavier somehow. The afternoon light had turned gray, and even Mrs. Peterson's curtains stayed still, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Later that night, after they left, Frank sat alone with the chessboard. He picked up the black king Marcus had knocked over. The boy was getting better, learning to think ahead, to see patterns. But some patterns, Frank thought bitterly, were too old, too deep to change with a few chess moves. The doorbell rang again. Frank opened it to find a piece of paper on his welcome mat. In crude letters, someone had written, "Keep to your own kind, old man." Frank crumpled the note and threw it away. But he couldn't throw away the memory of Marcus's face when Bill Thompson had come to the door, or Diana's tired eyes as she talked about losing her job. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "James? It's Frank Morrison. Remember that favor you owe me? I need help getting a good woman a job at Palmer Insurance." His old student, now a senior manager at Palmer, listened quietly. "She's a hard worker, James. Single mom. Smart as they come." Frank paused. "And she's black. If that matters to you." "Doesn't matter to me, Coach," James replied. "What's her name?" Diana Williams, she has an interview next week. Had an interview. Past tense. James's voice softened. Consider it done, coach. I've been looking for someone reliable for that position anyway. After hanging up, Frank stared at the chessboard again. One move at a time, he thought. Just like he taught Marcus. One move at a time. The knock came at 10 a.m. sharp. Frank had just finished his morning coffee when he saw the woman standing on his porch through the window. Navy blue blazer, clipboard in hand, official-looking ID badge. His stomach tightened. Mr. Morrison. She extended her hand. I'm Patricia Summers from Child Protective Services. May I come in? Frank's throat went dry. He stepped aside, letting her enter. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she surveyed the living room. Can I offer you some coffee? Frank asked, trying to keep his voice steady. No, thank you. She sat on the couch, right where Marcus usually sat. I'm here about Marcus Williams. Frank lowered himself into his recliner. What about him? We've received concerns from community members about the nature of your relationship with the minor. She clicked her pen. How often does Marcus visit your home? Every weekday after school. 4 chess lessons. Chess lessons. She made a note. And his mother approves of these visits. She arranged them. Frank's hands gripped the armrests. After I saved Marcus's life. Patricia looked up. Yes, I read the police report about the accident. Very heroic. But that doesn't explain the continued contact. I'm a retired teacher. I help him with homework. We play chess. Frank gestured to the board. Nothing sinister about that. Mr. Morrison, surely you understand how this looks. A man your age, spending hours alone with a 12-year-old boy. Stop right there. Frank stood up, ignoring the twinge in his healing rib. I taught children for 30 years. Never once was my character questioned. That was in a school setting. This is different, because Marcus is black. Patricia's expression didn't change. Race isn't the issue here, Mr. Morrison. We're concerned about appropriate boundaries. Boundaries? Frank laughed bitterly. I have the door open every time he visits. Diana comes by whenever she can. The whole neighborhood watches through their windows. What other boundaries would you suggest? The social worker made more notes. Has Marcus ever spent the night here? Of course not. Does he change clothes here? Use the bathroom? Shower? He uses the bathroom if he needs to. Like any human being would. Frank felt his face growing hot. What exactly are you implying? I'm not implying anything, Mr. Morrison. I'm investigating concerns brought to our attention by multiple sources. A car door slammed outside. Frank glanced out the window to see Diana parking her car. She wore a new business suit, the one she'd bought for her insurance company interviews. The doorbell rang. Patricia raised an eyebrow. Expecting company? Frank opened the door. Diana's smile faded when she saw the social worker. What's going on? She asked, stepping inside. Mrs. Williams. Patricia stood. I'm Patricia Summers from CPS. We're discussing your son's relationship with Mr. Morrison. Diana's face hardened. You mean you're harassing an elderly man who saved my son's life and has been tutoring him ever since? We take all reports of suspicious activity seriously. Suspicious? Diana's voice rose. The only suspicious activity is how quickly you showed up after I got that job offer from Palmer Insurance. Did Mrs. Peterson next door call you? Or was it someone from the diner who didn't like seeing a black woman move up in the world? Patricia cleared her throat. Mrs. Williams, your son's safety is our only concern. My son was never safer than the day Mr. Morrison pulled him out of the path of a truck. Diana moved to stand beside Frank, and has never been happier than when he's learning chess and improving his grades. Nevertheless, we have a duty to investigate. Patricia turned to Frank. We'll be conducting interviews at Marcus's school. In the meantime, I strongly suggest suspending these chess lessons. Like hell, Diana snapped. You have no right, Mrs. Williams, if you interfere with our investigation. Investigation? Frank cut in. You mean witch hunt? Patricia packed up her clipboard. I'll be in touch. And Mr. Morrison? No contact with Marcus until our investigation is complete. After she left, Diana collapsed onto the couch, hands shaking. I can't believe this. I just can't. The job offer, Frank remembered. What happened? Got it. Diana smiled weakly. Thanks to your friend James. But now this. Frank sat beside her. Maybe we should stop the lessons. Just until. No. Diana's voice was firm. They drove me out of the diner with their complaints. They're not driving Marcus away from the one good thing in his life right now. The afternoon crept by. 3:30 came and went. Frank stared at the chessboard, pieces still set up from yesterday's game. At 4, Diana's phone rang. It was Marcus's school. What? Her face went pale. No, he always. I'll be right there. She hung up, grabbing her purse. Marcus never showed up for his last 2 classes. Frank stood. Let me help look, the social worker said. Damn what she said. Frank grabbed his coat. I know where he might be. They found Marcus at the park, sitting at one of the concrete chess tables where Frank used to play before the accident. His backpack lay forgotten on the ground. Baby. Diana rushed to him. Why weren't you in class? Marcus didn't look up. Tommy Thompson told everyone his dad said Mr. Frank was a pervert who likes little black boys. Frank felt like he'd been punched. Diana pulled Marcus into a hug. Then Kevin's mom told him he couldn't sit with me at lunch anymore. Marcus's voice cracked. And Miss Roberts looked at me weird in math class. She never did that before. Frank sat heavily on the bench. All those years of teaching, of helping kids, wiped away by whispers and suspicion. I hate them, Marcus whispered. I hate all of them. No. Frank touched the chess pieces on the concrete table. Hate's too easy. Makes you miss the winning moves. Marcus finally looked up. What winning moves? They're taking everything away. Son, in chess and in life, sometimes you have to let your opponent think they are winning. Frank picked up a black pawn. Let them take what they think is important, while you set up the moves that really matter. Diana watched them, understanding dawning in her eyes. The community meeting. Next week at the school. Frank nodded. Time to show our cards. But the social worker said. Marcus started. She said no chess lessons at my house. Frank set up the pieces on the concrete table. Never said anything about the park. A small smile crept onto Marcus's face. Can we play one game? Diana checked her phone. A quick one. Then you're writing apology notes to your afternoon teachers. As they played, Frank noticed other parents walking by, pulling their children closer, whispering behind their hands. But for the first time, he didn't care. Let them whisper. Let them spread their poison. Because Frank had taught chess long enough to know, sometimes the loudest moves weren't the winning ones. Sometimes victory came in silence, in patience, in letting your opponents reveal their true nature while you protected what really mattered. Marcus captured Frank's bishop with a move they'd practiced last week. His eyes shone with pride. Good move, son, Frank said, loud enough for the passing parents to hear. Very good move indeed. The classroom fell silent when Marcus's chair crashed to the floor. Mrs. Henderson's math lesson stopped mid-equation as 28 pairs of eyes turned to stare. I'm not a victim. Marcus stood over his fallen chair, fists clenched. Stop looking at me like that. Kevin, who'd been whispering something to the girl next to him, slid lower in his seat. The paper airplane someone had thrown at Marcus's head lay crumpled on his desk. Marcus, Mrs. Henderson said carefully. Please pick up your chair and sit down. No. Marcus's voice shook. I heard what they said. About Mr. Frank. About me. Marcus, we should discuss this in private. Mrs. Henderson moved toward him, but Marcus backed away. You think he's hurting me? Tears streamed down his face. He's the only one who's not hurting me. The classroom door opened. Mr. Phillips, the school counselor, stood in the doorway. Mrs. Henderson? The principal would like to see Marcus. Marcus grabbed his backpack, kicking the chair aside. As he stormed out, someone whispered, Freak. In the principal's office, Diana sat with her hands folded in her lap, her new office clothes wrinkled from rushing over. Principal Watson leaned against his desk, while Mr. Phillips took notes. He's never acted out like this before, Diana said. Marcus is a good kid. Mrs. Williams, Principal Watson sighed. Given the current situation with Mr. Morrison, Frank Morrison saved my son's life. Diana's voice was ice. And now he's helping save his future. The social worker's report is garbage. Diana stood up. Where's my son? Mr. Phillips cleared his throat. In my office, cooling down. But Mrs. Williams, we're concerned about Marcus's emotional state. His emotional state. Diana laughed without humor. My 12-year-old son can't focus in class because his classmates call him names. His teachers look at him like his damaged goods. And you're concerned about his emotional state. A knock at the door. Marcus entered, eyes red but chin high. Baby. Diana opened her arms. Marcus went to her, buried his face in her shoulder. I'm sorry, he mumbled. But Kevin said. What did Kevin say? Mr. Phillips prompted gently. Marcus pulled away from his mother. Said his mom told him Mr. Frank probably paid me to. He couldn't finish. Diana's face went pale. Principal Watson shifted uncomfortably. I want to go home, Marcus whispered. Of course. Diana gathered her purse. And tomorrow, Principal Watson cut in. We should discuss alternative arrangements. Perhaps a different classroom. Running away doesn't solve anything. The new voice made everyone turn. Frank Morrison stood in the doorway, leaning on his cane. Mr. Morrison, Principal Watson straightened. You're not supposed to be here. Actually, I am. Frank entered the room slowly. As a concerned citizen attending a public school, and as someone who taught in this district for 30 years, the social worker said I couldn't have Marcus at my house. Frank sat down carefully. She never said I couldn't speak up when I see injustice in my old workplace. Mr. Phillips closed his notebook. Perhaps we should all take a step back. No. Frank's voice filled the room. We've taken too many steps back already. I watched bullies when I taught PE. Knew which kids would pick on others in the locker room. But I never thought I'd see teachers and administrators enabling it. Principal Watson flushed. Now see here. Kevin's mother was my student once. So was Tommy Thompson's father. They learned jump rope and dodgeball and teamwork in my class. Frank looked at Marcus. Never taught them hate, though. They learned that somewhere else. Diana put her arm around Marcus's shoulders. What are you suggesting, Frank? I'm suggesting we stop pretending this is about protecting children. Frank stood up. Tomorrow, I'm coming to that community meeting. And I'm bringing 30 years of teaching records, letters from parents, photos from chess club tournaments. The social worker's investigation. Principal Watson started. We'll show exactly what's really going on here. Frank turned to Marcus. Son, remember what I taught you about chess? Marcus wiped his eyes. Sometimes you have to let them take your pieces to see their whole game. Frank nodded. Well, I've seen it, and I'm tired of playing defense. Outside the principal's office, the halls were empty. Classes continued behind closed doors. Diana's heels clicked on the linoleum as they walked out. You shouldn't have come, she said, but her voice was grateful. Couldn't let Marcus face this alone. Frank watched the boy walking ahead of them. I've seen too many kids broken by whispers and stares. At the car, Marcus turned around. Can we go to the park? Please. Diana checked her watch. I have to get back to work, baby. And you need to learn the next chess move. Frank finished. If you're willing to trust me for an hour, Diana. She looked at her son, then at Frank. The social worker can watch us play in the park. Frank smiled. Along with anyone else who wants to see what corruption really looks like. Marcus's face brightened slightly. Mom, please. Diana hugged him tight. 1 hour. Then straight home to finish your homework. At the park, the usual crowd of retirees and parents watched Frank and Marcus set up the chess pieces. Frank could hear the whispers, see the phones coming out to take pictures. Let them look, he told Marcus. Every picture they take shows exactly what we're doing. Just playing chess. Marcus moved his first piece. I almost hit Kevin today. Wanted to, but you didn't. No. Marcus captured one of Frank's pawns. Remembered what you said about control. About thinking ahead. Frank studied the board. You know why I love chess, Marcus? Because it doesn't care what color you are. Doesn't care how old you are. Only cares about how smart you play. A small crowd had gathered. Frank recognized Mrs. Peterson among them, her phone raised. Take all the pictures you want, Helen, he called out. Be sure to show them to the social worker. Show her how we're corrupting the youth with chess. Some of the onlookers had the decency to look embarrassed. Others drifted away, but a few stayed, watching as Marcus executed a perfect castle maneuver. Good move, Frank said proudly. Very good move. When Diana returned an hour later, she found them surrounded by a small group of people, not all hostile. Old Mr. Jenkins from the hardware store had pulled up a chair to watch. A young mother with 2 kids had stopped to let her children see the game. Time to go, baby, Diana called. Marcus reset the pieces carefully. Thanks, Mr. Frank, for everything. See you at the meeting tomorrow. Frank asked Diana. She nodded. Front row. As they drove away, Frank remained at the chess table. Helen Peterson approached, her phone still in hand. "You're making a mistake, Frank," she said. These people. Frank stood up slowly. "You mean my student? His mother? Or maybe you mean me, your neighbor of 20 years who suddenly became dangerous because I chose to help a child. The social worker will be at the meeting tomorrow." Frank picked up his cane. "Along with anyone else who wants to see what really goes on at this chess table. Maybe bring your phone, Helen. Document everything." He walked home alone, past the whispering neighbors, past the twitching curtains. In his mailbox, he found another anonymous note. "Last warning." Frank crumpled it up, but didn't throw it away. Instead, he added it to the growing file of letters, pictures, and phone records. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow they'd all see exactly what kind of game they were really playing. And like he'd taught Marcus, sometimes you had to lose a few pieces to win the game. The school cafeteria filled quickly that evening. Frank sat in his car, watching families file in through the rain. His teaching certificates and letters lay in a folder on the passenger seat. 30 years of memories, reduced to paper proof of his character. His phone buzzed. A text from Diana. "We're here. Ready when you are." Frank grabbed his folder and cane. His ribs had mostly healed, but tonight he needed the support. The walk to the cafeteria felt longer than usual, each step heavy with purpose. Inside, the room had been arranged with chairs facing a long table where Principal Watson sat with the school board members. Patricia Summers from CPS sat at one end, reviewing papers. Frank spotted Diana and Marcus in the front row. "Evening, Frank." Bill Thompson blocked his path. "Sure you want to do this?" "Step aside, Bill." Frank's voice was quiet but firm. "You've done enough damage." He made his way to the front, feeling the stares, hearing the whispers. Marcus gave him a small wave, which he returned, ignoring Patricia Summers's disapproving look. Principal Watson tapped his microphone. "If everyone could take their seats, we'll begin this community meeting to discuss recent concerns." "Concerns?" A voice rang out. Helen Peterson stood up. "That's a mild way of putting it. We're talking about the safety of our children." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Mrs. Peterson," Principal Watson tried to regain control. "We have a procedure. I have pictures." She held up her phone. "Of him with the boy in the park. Every day. Playing chess." Frank stood up. "Would you like to show everyone those pictures, Helen? Show them exactly what horrible things you caught me doing." Patricia Summers cleared her throat. "Mr. Morrison, please sit down. We'll hear from everyone in turn. Like you heard from everyone who called your office." Frank turned to face the crowd. "Who told you I was corrupting Marcus? That I was paying him? That I was—" "Frank," Diana's warning voice. "No, let's hear it all." Frank opened his folder. "While you look at these letters from parents spanning 30 years. While you read thank you notes from students who learned more than just PE in my class. Some of them are sitting in this room right now." Bill Thompson stood up. "That was different. You were a teacher then. And what am I now?" Frank's voice rose. "A monster? Because I helped a boy who needed it? Because I didn't check his skin color before pulling him from in front of that truck?" The room fell silent. "I worked at this school for 3 decades. Frank pulled out a yellowed photograph. "This is the chess club, 1992. Black kids, white kids, Asian kids, all playing together. Nobody called CPS then." He took another step forward. "Bill, your son Tommy was in that club. Remember how proud you were when he won his first tournament? Did you worry about him being alone with me then?" Bill looked away. "And you, Helen?" Frank turned to Mrs. Peterson. "Your daughter Lisa wrote me a letter when she graduated college. Said my lessons about perseverance helped her through medical school. It's in this folder. Want me to read it?" Patricia Summers stood up. "Mr. Morrison, this isn't about your teaching career. This is about appropriate boundaries." "No," Marcus's voice cut through the tension. He stood up, shaking but determined. "This is about hate." Diana tried to pull him back down, but he stepped into the aisle. "You all watched Mr. Frank teach me chess in the park. Took pictures. Made phone calls." Marcus's voice grew stronger. "But none of you ever came to see how he helped me with math. How my grades went from Ds to As. How he taught me to think before I act." "Son," Principal Watson started, but Marcus wasn't finished. "My dad left when I was 4. Never taught me anything." Marcus looked at Frank. Mr. Frank taught me that winning isn't about being stronger or faster. It's about being smarter, about seeing the whole board. Diana stood beside her son. When Frank Morrison pulled Marcus from in front of that truck, none of you cared about appropriate boundaries. You called him a hero, put his picture in the local paper. What changed? The silence was deafening. Frank walked to the front table, placing his folder in front of Patricia Summers. Everything you need to know about me is in there. Every letter, every picture, every achievement over 30 years of teaching. But the truth isn't in those papers. He turned to face the crowd again. The truth is in what you're not seeing. You're not seeing Marcus's improved grades. You're not seeing his mother's pride when he solves a difficult problem. You're not seeing the real reason you're all here tonight. And what is that reason, Mr. Morrison? Patricia Summers asked. Fear. Frank's voice softened. Not fear for your children. Fear of what it means when people different from you come together. Fear of what it means when an old white man and a young black boy can sit at a chessboard and see nothing but the game. He walked over to Marcus, putting a hand on his shoulder. I lost my wife 5 years ago. Lost my purpose. Then I saw a boy about to be hit by a truck, and I didn't see color. I saw a child in danger, just like I saw a child who needed help with math. A child who needed to learn that life, like chess, requires patience and strategy. Diana stepped forward. I got that job at Palmer Insurance. The one some of you tried to prevent with your complaints. Know what I'll be doing? Managing accounts for half the people in this room. Murmurs swept through the crowd. So here's what's going to happen, Frank continued. Marcus and I will keep playing chess in the park, in full view of everyone. Diana will excel at her new job, and this community will have a choice. He looked at Patricia Summers. You can keep investigating, keep taking pictures, keep filing reports, or you can come watch our games. Learn something, maybe even join us. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then, from the back of the room, a hand raised. It was Mr. Jenkins from the hardware store. I'd like to learn, the old man said. Used to watch them play. Never saw anything but a teacher and student. Maybe it's time I learned the game myself. Another hand. A young mother with 2 kids. My children could use tutoring. If you're offering, Mr. Morrison. Slowly, more hands raised. Not everyone, but enough. Frank felt Marcus's shoulder relax under his hand. Principal Watson cleared his throat. Perhaps we've been too hasty in our concerns. Perhaps, Frank agreed. So what's it going to be? More investigations? Or more chessboards in the park? Patricia Summers closed her folder. I'll need to file a report. File it. Frank smiled. Document everything. Show them all exactly what you found. An old teacher doing what is always done. Teaching. The meeting dissolved into small groups, some leaving quickly, others lingering to talk. Frank sat heavily in a chair, emotionally drained. Marcus sat beside him. Did we win? Frank thought about the chess lessons he'd given. About seeing the whole board. About knowing when you'd achieved checkmate even if your opponent hadn't realized it yet. We played our game, son. He squeezed Marcus's shoulder. We played our game. A week after the community meeting, Frank stood in Principal Watson's office, his proposal laid out on the desk between them. An after-school chess program. Principal Watson adjusted his glasses. I don't know, Frank. The board is still sensitive about. The board can come watch. Frank tapped the paper. Every session. Every lesson. Just like they watch in the park. Principal Watson sighed. And you'd volunteer? No payment. Same as I've been doing with Marcus. Frank leaned forward. Look, Tom, you've known me for 20 years. When have I ever steered you wrong? It's not about trust anymore. The principal stood, pacing behind his desk. It's about liability. Protocol. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mr. Phillips, the school counselor, entered with a stack of papers. Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see these. He placed the papers on the desk. Student petition. Over 200 signatures. Frank picked up the top sheet. In Marcus's careful handwriting. We want Mr. Frank to teach us chess. Principal Watson read through the signatures. How did this happen? Marcus started it. Mr. Phillips explained. But it spread. Kids talk, Tom. They've seen him teaching in the park. They want to learn. Frank smiled, remembering Marcus's words from yesterday. I told them how chess helped my math grades. How it makes you think different. The principal sat heavily in his chair. The school board meets Thursday. I'll present your proposal. I'll be there, Frank said. Front row. Just like last time. Outside the office, Marcus waited on a bench, homework spread around him. How'd it go? We'll see Thursday. Frank sat beside him. Your petition idea might help. Marcus grinned. Mom says sometimes you have to show people what they are missing. Speaking of your mom, how's the new job? She got her own office yesterday. Marcus's chest puffed with pride. With a nameplate and everything. Diana Williams, account manager. Frank helped Marcus gather his books. Ready for today's lesson. They walked to the park together, their usual chess table now surrounded by additional chairs. Mr. Jenkins sat waiting, his own chess set ready. Brought my grandfather's board, the old man said. Figured it's time to put it to use. More people gathered as Frank began the lesson. Not just students, parents watched from nearby benches, some taking notes instead of pictures. Chess isn't just about moving pieces, Frank explained to the small crowd. It's about seeing patterns, understanding consequences. A movement caught his eye. Mrs. Peterson stood at the edge of the park, watching. But instead of her phone, she held a notebook. Marcus raised his hand. Can I show them the castle move? The one that helped me understand geometry. The floor is yours, son. As Marcus demonstrated, Frank noticed other changes. The whispers had shifted from suspicion to interest. The stares held curiosity instead of judgment. Diana arrived later, still in her business suit, carrying a cardboard box. What's all this? Frank asked. She opened the box, revealing dozens of cheap plastic chess sets. Company donation. They heard about the program and wanted to help. Mom got them at cost, Marcus added proudly. Said it was her first big account decision. Frank picked up one of the sets. Enough for a whole classroom. Enough for two. Diana smiled. The board approved emergency funding for after-school programs, something about improving community relations. The afternoon stretched on. Parents who had once hurried past now stopped to ask questions. Children who had avoided Marcus at school gathered around to watch him play. Check, Marcus announced, trapping Mr. Jenkins as king. The old man laughed. Been playing chess for 40 years. Never saw that coming. You've got quite a teacher, son. I know. Marcus reset the pieces. He teaches more than chess. Later, as the sun began to set, Frank packed up the boards. His phone buzzed, a text from Patricia Summers, closing investigation. Final report shows no evidence of inappropriate conduct. Recommending approval for school program. Diana read the message over his shoulder. Guess they finally saw the whole board. They saw what was always there. Frank pocketed his phone. People doing what people should do, helping each other. Thursday came quickly. Frank sat in the school boardroom, his proposal now backed by student signatures, parent testimonials, and the closed CPS investigation. Board member Harris shuffled his papers. Mr. Morrison, your after-school program would be open to all students. Any student willing to learn. Frank gestured to the chess sets Diana had donated. We have the equipment. We have the space. We have kids eager to start. And supervision. Besides me. Frank smiled. Diana Williams has offered to help coordinate. Mr. Jenkins wants to assist. Even Helen Peterson asked about volunteering. The board members exchanged looks. Chairman Roberts cleared his throat. There's still the matter of your recent controversy. You mean saving a boy's life and teaching him chess? Frank's voice carried across the room. Or do you mean the controversy some people created because they couldn't see past their own prejudices? Silence fell. Then board member Martinez spoke up. My son signed that petition. Says he's been watching the games in the park. Wants to learn. She looked at her colleagues. Maybe it's time we learn something too. The vote was unanimous. In the hallway afterward, Frank found Marcus waiting with Diana. Did they say yes? Marcus bounced on his toes. First session starts Monday. Frank held up the official approval. Right after school, Marcus hugged him, then stepped back quickly, remembering they were in school. But Frank didn't care who saw anymore. Proud of you, son. He squeezed Marcus's shoulder. You showed everyone what real strength looks like. Diana wiped her eyes. Both of you did. They walked to the park together, where their usual chess table had somehow multiplied into several. Students already waited with their new sets. Ready for your first official lesson? Frank asked the group. A dozen hands shot up, voices calling out questions. Frank caught Marcus's eye and nodded. Go ahead, he said. Show them how it's done. Marcus stepped forward, confidence in every move. First thing to remember, chess isn't about what the pieces look like. It's about how they work together. Frank sat back, watching his student become a teacher. Across the park, he saw faces that had once held suspicion now showing respect. Heard laughter where there had been whispers. Sometimes, he thought, the best moves in life were just like chess, patient, purposeful, and powerful enough to change the whole game. The local newspaper photographer adjusted his camera as Frank and Marcus set up the chessboards in the school gymnasium. The headline would read, Former PE teacher organizes community chess tournament. Little to the left, Mr. Morrison, the photographer called out. And Marcus, could you move that trophy case where we can see it? Always wanted my picture in the paper, Marcus joked, shifting the display. Just didn't think it'd be for chess. Frank arranged the chairs in rows. 6 weeks of after-school classes had drawn enough interest for a proper tournament. 32 players signed up, ages 8 to 80. Mr. Frank, Tommy Thompson burst through the gym doors. Dad's bringing the refreshments, and he wants to know if there's still room to sign up. Frank looked up, surprised. Bill wants to play. Tommy nodded eagerly. Been practicing with me every night. Says he's got a lot to make up for. The gym slowly filled with people and voices. Diana arrived in her business suit, carrying a stack of printed brackets. Company printed these for free, she said, laying them out. And wait till you see what else they donated. She opened a large box, revealing gleaming metal trophies. First, second, and third place, each engraved with Community Chess Championship 2025. Mom, they're beautiful. Marcus ran his fingers over the engravings. Well, a familiar voice called from the doorway. Looks like I picked the right time to stop by. Patricia Summers stood there, no clipboard in sight. Just a chess set under her arm. Didn't know you played, Frank said. She smiled. There's a lot we didn't know about each other, Mr. Morrison. Mind if I join? The tournament brackets filled quickly. Bill Thompson apologized to Frank privately before taking his seat. Helen Peterson brought homemade cookies and set up a refreshment table. Even Principal Watson signed up, admitting he was probably rusty. Welcome, everyone, Frank addressed the crowd. Before we start, I want you to look around this room. A month ago, some of us couldn't sit at the same chessboard. Today, we're all here to play the same game. Diana stepped forward. And to celebrate that, Palmer Insurance has agreed to make this a monthly event. With proper funding for equipment, refreshments, and yes, those shiny trophies. Applause filled the gym. Marcus beamed from his seat, already studying his first opponent's setup. The games began. Frank walked between tables, watching generations of his community face each other across chessboards. Tommy Thompson played against Mr. Jenkins. Helen Peterson matched wits with one of Marcus's classmates. Bill Thompson got soundly beaten by a 9-year-old girl. Your student's doing well, Patricia said, joining Frank near Marcus's table. They watched as Marcus executed a complex strategy they'd practiced. His opponent, a high school junior, frowned in concentration. Is doing more than well, Frank replied. Is teaching others what he learned. About chess. About life. Frank nodded toward another table, where 2 boys, one black, one white, discussed their game animatedly. About seeing beyond the surface of things. Diana approached with a local reporter. Frank? They'd like to interview you about the program. The reporter clicked his pen. Mr. Morrison, did you expect this kind of turnout? Frank looked around the gym. At Bill Thompson cheering his son's clever move. At Patricia Summers giving pointers to a young player. At Marcus, focused and confident at his board. I expected people to learn, he said. Didn't know what they'd learn, but that's the thing about teaching. Sometimes the best lessons aren't the ones you plan. And the controversy from last month? What controversy? Frank smiled. All I see are people playing chess. The day wore on. Players were eliminated, but most stayed to watch. The finals came down to Marcus and, surprisingly, Helen Peterson, who'd played chess in college. Never thought I'd be here, she admitted during their game. Never thought I'd see things so differently. Marcus captured her bishop. Mr. Frank says chess shows us new ways to look at old problems. Check, Helen announced a few moves later. Marcus studied the board, then smiled. The move they practiced last week, he saw it now. Checkmate, he said quietly, sliding his queen into position. The gym erupted in applause. Diana rushed to hug her son while Frank watched proudly. "Well played, both of you," he said. Helen extended her hand to Marcus. "Rematch next month?" "Yes." Marcus shook it firmly. "And maybe you can show me that bishop trap you used earlier." During the trophy presentation, Diana took the microphone. "I want to tell you all a story," she began, "about a rainy night when an old white man saved a young black boy from an accident. Some people tried to make that story ugly, tried to twist it into something it wasn't." She looked at Frank. "But the real story wasn't about color, or age, or fear. It was about community, about learning to see each other as people, about understanding that sometimes the best moves in life come from unlikely places." Marcus lifted his trophy high, grinning at Frank. "So today," Diana continued, "Palmer Insurance isn't just sponsoring a chess tournament. We're announcing a new community outreach program. Free tutoring, mentorship, and yes, chess lessons for any kid who wants to learn." More applause. Frank felt a hand on his shoulder. Bill Thompson stood there, eyes moist. "I was wrong," Bill said simply. "About everything." "Not everything." Frank patted his hand. "You raise a good son, and you learned from him. That's what matters." As people began packing up, Marcus brought his trophy to Frank's table. "Where should we put it?" he asked. "Your house," Frank started, but Marcus shook his head. "Our house," he corrected. "The chess house, where everyone's welcome." Frank looked at Diana, who nodded. "The chess house it is." He picked up a piece from the board. "Ready for tomorrow's lesson?" "Already got students lined up." Marcus grinned. "Kevin wants to learn that queen sacrifice we used today." And Tommy's dad asked about advanced strategies. They walked out together, Frank, Marcus, and Diana, into a community that felt different now. Not perfect, not completely changed, but different enough to matter. At the park, their usual chess table stood empty in the evening light. But tomorrow it would fill again, with new players, new lessons, and new understanding. "You know what, Mr. Frank?" Marcus said as they reached the parking lot. "I think we really did see the whole board." Frank smiled. "We sure did, son. We sure did." Rain fell softly on the park's new pavilion roof. 1 year to the day since the accident, and the weather seemed determined to recreate the scene. But everything else had changed. Frank stood under the shelter, watching people hurry in from their cars with covered dishes and chess sets. The parks department had installed 6 permanent chess tables last month, complete with weatherproof boards and storage benches. "Looking good, Mr. Frank," Marcus called out, helping his mother carry a large cake box. The cake's inscription read, "1 year of community chess, where every move matters." Diana set down the box and straightened her management blazer. "Can't believe it's been a year. Sometimes feels like yesterday," Frank said, touching his side where the fractured rib had healed. "Sometimes feels like a lifetime ago." Tables filled with food lined one wall of the pavilion. Helen Peterson arranged her famous cookies next to Bill Thompson's barbecue. The monthly tournament had evolved into a full community gathering. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia Summers approached, carrying a gift bag. "The department wanted me to present this officially, but, well, I thought it should be more personal." Inside the bag, Frank found a framed certificate. "Community Youth Mentor of the Year." "The irony isn't lost on me," Patricia smiled wryly. "But you earned it. We all learned something this year." Thunder rumbled overhead, but no one seemed worried about the rain anymore. If anything, it made the pavilion feel cozy, more intimate. Principal Watson arrived with a group of teachers. "Ready for the big match, Marcus?" Marcus nodded, fingers drumming nervously on the chess table. The state junior chess championship qualifier would start in an hour. "He's ready," Frank said confidently. "Been ready for months." The pavilion filled quickly. Students from Frank's after-school program. Parents who'd once whispered behind closed doors, now bringing food and encouragement. Even some faces Frank didn't recognize. Word had spread beyond their small community. Diana took the microphone they'd set up. "Before we start today's tournament, I'd like to say a few words." The crowd quieted. 1 year ago tonight, my son was riding his bike in the rain. 1 year ago tonight, a man I didn't know saved his life. She looked at Frank. But that wasn't the only life that changed that night. She gestured around the pavilion. "Look at us now. Palmer Insurance's community outreach program has helped 50 kids improve their grades. Our chess program has spread to 3 other schools. And next week, I'm being promoted to Regional Director of Community Relations. Applause echoed under the metal roof. Marcus squeezed his mother's hand. But more importantly, Diana continued, we learned to see each other. Really see each other. Not as colors or ages or categories, but as people. As neighbors. As friends. The mayor stepped forward next, holding an official-looking document. Mr. Morrison, he announced, the City Council has unanimously voted to name this pavilion the Frank Morrison Chess Park. A place where everyone is welcome to learn, to teach, and to grow together. Frank blinked back tears as the sign was unveiled. Below his name, the inscription read, every piece has value. Every player has potential. Speech, someone called out. Others joined in. Frank stood slowly, leaning on his cane more for comfort than necessity now. A year ago, he began, I told Marcus that chess shows us how to see the whole board. How to look past what's right in front of us and understand the bigger picture. He looked at his student, his friend, sitting ready for his qualifying match. But Marcus taught me something too. He taught me that sometimes the bravest move isn't the most obvious one. Sometimes it's just staying in the game when others want you to quit. Thunder crashed again, but nobody flinched. This pavilion, these tables, these tournaments, they are not about chess. Not really. They're about choices. About choosing to learn instead of fear. To understand instead of judge. To build instead of break. Marcus stood up. Mr. Frank, it's time. The qualifying match drew everyone's attention. Marcus faced a highly-ranked player from the City Chess League. Frank had helped him prepare. But this was Marcus's game to play. Cameras flashed. Not suspicious phones hidden behind curtains, but proud parents documenting a moment. The local paper's photographer captured each move. An hour into the game, Marcus caught Frank's eye and nodded slightly. They'd practiced this position. Checkmate in 3 moves, Marcus announced quietly. His opponent studied the board, then smiled and extended his hand. Well played. See you at States. The pavilion erupted in cheers. Diana hugged her son while Frank watched, heart full. Later, as people mingled and played casual games, Mr. Jenkins approached Frank. Remember what you told me a year ago? The old man asked. When I said I wanted to learn, Frank shook his head. You said it's never too late to see things differently. Mr. Jenkins gestured at the crowded pavilion. You were right. The rain started to ease as the evening wore on. Students challenged their parents. Former critics played alongside old friends. The boundaries that had once seemed so rigid had blurred and faded. Marcus found Frank by the cake table. Mom says the company's expanding the program. Other cities want to start their own chess parks. Your idea about using chess to teach math really caught on. Frank nodded. Proud of you, son. Proud of us. Marcus corrected. We did it together. All of us. Diana joined them, cake in hand. The mayor wants to talk about after-school funding. Apparently, our test scores have improved so much, other districts are asking questions. Frank watched a group of kids setting up a new game. Black and white pieces arranged with care. Players focused only on the game ahead. You know what Sarah would say about all this? He said softly. Diana touched his arm. What? She'd say sometimes life's best moves find us when we're not looking for them. When we're just trying to do the right thing. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows through the pavilion. Frank saw Mrs. Peterson teaching chess to a young black girl. Saw Bill Thompson and his son playing against Marcus's classmates. Saw Patricia Summers taking notes, not for investigations now, but to help start similar programs in other communities. 1 year, Diana mused. Hard to believe. Time for a game. Marcus asked, already setting up the pieces. Frank sat down across from him. Around them, the community they'd helped build continued to grow, to learn, to change. Move by move, piece by piece, person by person. Your move, son, Frank said. Marcus smiled and moved his first piece. Above them, the new sign gleamed in the evening light. Frank Morrison Chess Park. Where every piece has value. Where every player has potential. Where a split-second decision in the rain had started more than just a game. A place where every move truly mattered.